So with that said, I think that staying present, first of all, involves having a deep engagement with something in life. For some people, that's Christianity. For some people, that's basketball. For some people, that's school. But we need something that we're passionate about, where we can experience joy, because that thing, that object that we hold on to, in this case, basketball, for example, that helps us stay grounded, and it gives us sort of a foreshadow of what life could be about and what the potential of life is. One of the things that we talk about a lot is being mindful, right? So mindfulness is being able to sit with ourselves without judgment. This is the key.
You are listening to the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast, transforming athletes into leaders on and off the court with host Coach Furtado. Coaches, are you ready to take your passion for coaching and turn it into a full-time career? I know the challenges firsthand, but the Make Money Coaching Sports program helped me take BTG basketball full-time. If you're tired of juggling coaching part-time and want to fully focus on doing what you love, this business accelerator will give you the tools and support to make it happen. Hit the link in the show notes below to learn more and start living your dream. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast. We are live in person today. Marcus, I appreciate you being in the studio. It's been a while.
Yes, I appreciate you having me.
Of course. So we're going to have a great conversation. So Marcus is an educator and a psychotherapist. So as we dive right into that, this is going to be a great conversation for you coaches and parents who want to make an impact on your athletes on the emotional side. And so before we kind of talk about the work you're doing, I would love for you to share your story around how sports made an impact on your life beyond the scoreboard.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Growing up, I was raised in South Central Los Angeles, and during the 92 uprisings, so I'm part of that generation. Sports for me was a safe haven. It was a place to build community. I didn't have a lot of mentors. I didn't have a dad in my life. And that really shaped my perception of myself. You know, I always felt like I was missing some huge part of me. And one of the things that sports did for me is it helped me build confidence. And it also helped build community. It kept me out of trouble because, as you can imagine, growing up in any environment, especially when there's no role models, you're susceptible to a lot of things that can happen in the streets, such as drugs, gang banging. So it helped me stay focused. It helped me learn about life. I think basketball in particular taught me the value of community and friendship, how to work within community, right? When we think about basketball, it's a synergy. It's a collective, and every constituent of the whole contributes to that synergy, and everyone is vital. Even if you're not scoring per se, your presence just alone on the court can make such a huge difference. I was someone that was a hustler, right? I played point forward. I contributed in many ways, not just in scoring, but passing the ball, rebounding, and being in tune with my teammates, right? Knowing how they flow and trying to anticipate their next moves. So in that way, all of those things are so reflective in life, right? When we think about working within community, what does it mean? We live in a capitalistic structure that for a lot of us is about it's really kind of a selfish point of view. What can I do? How do I shape reality? How do I? How often do we think in terms of we? I once read that a society is based on the most vulnerable person. And so if we take that approach, you know, how can we work together in terms of making sure that the most vulnerable person is empowered?
100%. And that's a great place to start our conversation. And there's so much in there that we're going to kind of break down and unpack. And kind of touching on your last point, right? There's the saying you're talking about in society, we are a representative of our most vulnerable population. And I'm sure you've heard with teams, right? With your team is as good as your weakest link, right? The quote unquote. And so you just, uncovered so many different parallels that basketball and sport has into real life. And that's what it's all about with teaching these kids. So can you talk about your journey from, how did sports really kind of launch or help you transition into bringing you opportunities to go to great schools like UCLA and Michigan, and then to become a psychotherapist?
Yeah. So one of the things that sports really instilled in me was discipline. Having structure and routine. So being able to practice fundamentals. And when you think about greatness, or when we think about success, some people think about success as having money, having material possessions. But success, in my point of view, is how well do you manage yourself? How well do you show up and care for yourself? And I'm thankful for that lesson, because the more in tune you are with yourself, the more spiritually rich you are. And that will take you so much further in life. So learning the fundamentals, sometimes we think we have to, we have to go to the gym eight times a week, right. Which, that's obviously a hyperbole, right? You can't go to the gym 8 times a week, but we treat it. Yeah, that's true. But we think we have to do these massive things in life to achieve greatness. But from everything that I've appreciated thus far, greatness is learned through surrendering. But most importantly, it's learned through being able to care for yourself and create some sort of structure for yourself and working on those fundamentals. That's how everyone gets great. And when we break it down to that level, it is applicable in life. We don't have to go out and spend, when I was a minister, that's something else that would probably be helpful to talk about. I was a minister for 10 years. And when I would preach to certain people, I would hear stories about people spending $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 to go on these spiritual retrievals.
Right.
And that would blow my mind.
Right.
Because I'm like, why, how, first of all, how do we get caught up in these type of things? But why do we feel like we have to do that in order to be great? We're already great. So, yeah.
So you're kind of talking about it's already within us. And I think this is something that we talked about a little bit before on our conversation today, and then a little bit before when we talked a few weeks ago, is I really like how you're kind of shaping it in terms of it's already within us, right? We don't need to, always, whether we're scrolling on Instagram and we need to go somewhere else and, just always seeking and searching for answers. And I feel like in society today, like we're even more trying to, find, little ways or things that are going to bring us joy when we need to really start going within ourselves. Yes. Can you kind of talk about how that really, that at what point in time, was it someone that told you something? Was it like inner self-reflection? How did you kind of come to this? And then how do you feel like that can help, our coaches and parents actually show up better for our athletes?
Wow, you are really hitting on some great discussion. I mean, this is so rich. I don't know how it came to me, to be honest. I think that, speaking energetically to all of you out there, I think it's something we all know deep down inside, but society tries everything within our power to make us docile and not believe in ourselves. I've had mentors, to answer your question. I think that at the right moments helped me remember who I was. I once read that all of us at times, when we are facing fears and we get sad and depressed, it is so normal, first of all, to experience fear. It is so normal to experience depression. It is so normal to feel like you're not at your best self from moment to moment. But the key to remember is that when we're in those psychological states that I just described, We want to remember who we are. And that's how we return back to ourselves. And sometimes, and most of the time, we can't do that on our own. We need other people. And we need people not just in our circle, because not everyone in our circle is our friend. We need people in our corner. And that's and how many and if we can all take inventory, how many people are actually in our corner, the number will probably be smaller than
Right.
in our circle. And that's okay, because not everyone is meant to be in our corner. But the people who are in our corner help us remember who we are. And I've been fortunate, although I didn't have a father figure throughout my life. There have been men and women who have come into my life at certain moments right when I needed it to help encourage me and help me remember who I was, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. That's beautiful. And I feel like this is perfect for this podcast because as parents and coaches and really leaders of athletes, we have such a big influence on our athletes that we can have that relationship where we can help guide and influence young people to figure out and discover who they are. I think that's one of the beautiful journeys of high school and college. And obviously, life is a continuous self-discovery. I'm sure me and you are discovering things about ourselves every day. We're trying to grow. We're like recognizing, oh, this is an old pattern that I'm having a hard time breaking. And that's one of the beautiful parts of being a coach is honestly, sometimes the kids end up teaching us a lot more about ourselves.
Absolutely.
We really even thought we were teaching them.
That's the secret to life, actually, is that some of my patients will tell me, and my clients, they'll say, thank you so much for working with me. And I don't know if this goes over their head or not, but I say that the honor is truly mine, because nothing in life works one-sided. I'm learning too. And we need each other. We're social beings. And we can't learn in isolation. And I think, to your point, going back to what you're saying, how did I arrive at this point, is that I also realized I couldn't survive in isolation. And as men, there's been a lot of developments happening in this generation, Generation Z for men. Young men are not attending college, going back in recent decades. Women are disproportionate in a lot of the different categories that you would typically see men excelling in different generations.
Right.
And so a lot of men who are in the field who specialize in men's health and mind health have talked about this crisis that we're entering into. And all of these things are sort of can reinforce this reality of I'm just alone. I don't really have anyone. And one of the things that's so hard to break free from that is to realize that the more we fear that, or the more we reinforce that into our life, the more that becomes a reality. And we kind of talked about this before.
Yes.
We have a perception bias, right? We have a negative bias, but we have a perception bias. And when we think about a perception bias, I'm just looking at my notes right now. We don't actually, and I wrote about this, we don't actually experience reality. We experience a predictive path of motion. And when you really think about this in basketball, right, it's so applicable, right? Because if we're not aware that we're experiencing life objectively and we're just moving unconsciously, then we are foreclosing on so many different possibilities in life. And that's why we talk about how do we stay present, right? Because being present is within the time-space collapse. When we think about physics, and we talked a little bit about physics, right? There's so many different possibilities here, even in this moment right now, right? And if we already foreclose on the idea that I'm not worthy, and we don't do this consciously, we do this unconsciously, that affects our flow. It affects how we move, right? On top of that, if we've already predicted the outcome of something, then how can we reach our full potential in that moment? So these are some of the conversations that are so important when we're working with athletes.
100%. And then we're creating our own internal environment, right?
Yes.
Upstairs. And so
Yes.
you dropped a lot of wisdom there. And so there's a couple of different things, right? You talked a little bit about the unconscious kind of mind. You also talked about predictive. I can't even read my writing. It's what do you say? Predictive. I'm drawing a blank, but just kind of a predictive emotions. Like we kind of are repeating these patterns over and over and over again, and we're kind of moving through life unconsciously. How can we help our athletes be more conscious, be more present?
Yeah, and this is where all the great disciplines and arts come into play. You have Sigmund Freud. For those of you who might know, and he's a very controversial figure in academia. In fact, when I first learned about Sigmund Freud, one of the first things that they said was everything he said was wrong about life. And that's not true. Sigmund Freud was an imperfect being, for sure. And we should never idealize anyone in life because, again, coming from the apparatus that we've talked about, it is within us, right? So if we're coming from any other apparatus, we're going to see and we're going to miscalculate things. But Sigmund Freud, one of the forefathers of psychology, right? When we think about Taoism, when we think about Kung Fu, when we think about social work, all of these philosophies, if you will, or frames, offer a unique perspective of the human condition. For that matter, Christianity, the same way. I don't subscribe to a particular frame. As a scholar, I consider myself a scholar. I draw from multiple frames because they help us understand a particular aspect of the human condition.
Right.
I got a little off on that, but you talked about how do we stay present.
Yep.
Okay. So with that said, I think that staying present, first of all, involves having a deep engagement with something in life. For some people, that's Christianity. For some people, that's basketball. For some people, that's school. But we need something that we're passionate about, where we can experience joy. Because that thing, that object that we hold on to, in this case, basketball, for example, that helps us stay grounded. And it gives us sort of a foreshadow of what life could be about and what the potential of life is. Other things that we can do to stay grounded is to simply breathe. These are these subtle things that can go so unrecognizable, right? In cognitive behavioral therapy, and this is a sort of a science-based approach to gaining more access to ourselves. One of the things that we talk about a lot is being mindful, right? So mindfulness is being able to sit with ourselves without judgment. This is the key. And this is where most of us fail sometimes miserably. Because whatever we're experiencing, especially if we're men, we've been socialized to think and feel guilty. Men are, as we've been told, can only experience two emotions, right? What is it? Aggression and what was the other one? I think we talked about this.
Aggression and I'm drawing a blank.
So
the point is, they're not a range,
exactly.
A limited amount of emotion.
Exactly. And it'll come to me what the other emotion is. But the point is that if we're only allowed to experience such a limited range of feelings, what does that do to our psyche? What does that do to our being? Right? So being present requires us to be mindful and being able to feel without judgment. And in that way, the external reality has to capitulate to our internal reality. It doesn't work the other way around.
So let's slow that down. Let's really break that down.
I know that was a handful.
Yeah. No, let's break that down because you're talking about kind of how these realities affect each other. And I would love to go into kind of the emotional side of things as well. So when we're talking about, right, and I remember this from our phone call because I remember we got into great conversation right away. And as men, right, we don't let ourselves feel, right? If we, we either shut it out, we either ignore it, we dismiss it, and we don't allow ourselves, right, to have these human experiences of emotion. And so can you kind of elaborate on, a little bit of how these, the coaches that are working can work on their emotions themselves, because there are a lot of men that are listening, because I feel like that would help them then become better at connecting with their athletes.
I really value these questions. First of all, it begins with coaches asking these questions.
Right.
First and foremost. So in Kung Fu, I'll use an illustration to keep this conversation grounded too, right? Because sometimes we can get so out there with these concepts that it's hard to come back down.
Right.
So in Kung Fu, to practice having a strong core, right? Which in our language would be a strong sense of self, right? They light a candle and the candle has fire. And what you're supposed to do is lift up your sleeves, and you're supposed to use your force to extinguish the fire. And sometimes during that process, especially if you're not seasoned, you might become anxious because it might take a long time. And you might be wondering, is it me? Right? And in those moments, what is encouraged is that the more anxious you become, the more you need to slow down.
I can testify that for myself. Yep.
So sometimes, when I was going through my own therapy journey, when I would hear these answers, I would kind of get a little disappointed, because sometimes you think you're going to hear this grandiose sort of explanation.
Right.
And then when you hear things like this, it is so simple, it can sort of go over our head.
Right.
Right. But the point of that illustration was to mark the reason why we want to slow down when we become anxious is because we want to get into flow, the state of flow. And you can't get into the state of flow, or you can't be present if you're anxious, right? So what resource do I have in my disposal immediately to get into flow? You breathe. And breathing allows us to pause, and it slows down our reaction time. Remember, the reaction is based upon a predictable behavior, right? When we react, it's often, and that's why when we get angry, we can say and do things that are wrong, because that reaction is based upon what we call a conditioned response, right? We are conditioned to react to certain stimuli. And as men, if we've never had a space to express our emotions, we get frustrated really easily when we don't feel like we're heard. But that's even more of a reason when we need to slow down in those moments and give that to ourselves. And we can do that by just simply saying, hey, I need a moment, right? That's so powerful. Instead of communicating out of anger, we can allow the anger to guide the response, right? So not to throw too many terms out here, but I call this having clean anger.
Okay.
Right. So being able to not let the anger control you, but let the anger guide you.
Gotcha. So one of the main points I hear from that is patience, and inviting that through your breath, right? Like you mastering that. And there's a very high percentage of this 2024 Olympic athletes that utilize breath to become high performers. And in order to be a high performer, you have to get into and tap into this flow state. And I can, as I heard you talking, I could either see myself, I could see some other coaches, right? When you're in a very competitive landscape, right? AKA a basketball game, there's a lot of things that can get very competitive, right? What happens is, we get so, and you can explain the science behind this. I'll just explain it in layman's terms. We just get so excited. We want to win so bad. In our hearts, obviously, it's pumping fast, and we got a million our brain's going a million miles an hour. I'm almost trying to like put myself in it and even talk faster as I'm trying to think.
You're doing a good job of painting a
So
picture.
kind of slowing it down, right? If you kind of look and see what some of the best coaches do when you watch on the sideline, doesn't matter what sport, like you can see a lot of the best coaches are calm, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the, I guess coaches that are maybe out of control are maybe need to utilize this breath. So
I would agree.
I would love to kind of dive into that, really just how that, kind of helps us either show up in a way that's calming for our athletes or a way that adds, extra anxiety onto them.
Yeah. And now as you're talking, I'm thinking about myself as a father, right? Because it's the same thing.
I can imagine, right? They can get under your skin.
Oh, they would. Yes. Yeah. Yes. But to your point about how to embody that, right? One of the things that I think is so important is emotional regulation, using, again, such a fancy term, because what does that even mean? What are we talking about when we say regulation, right? When we think about regulation, I think about recovery and stabilization. We can't always heal. And I think that being able to understand, first of all, what does it mean to stabilize ourselves in these moments is so important. When we think about the competitive environment that you brought up, and we think about when we get triggered, right? Triggers, here's another important part of this puzzle, right? Is trigger.
Right.
And being able to understand and become more curious about why we're being triggered in this moment is so important. Because in all honesty, right, in a very objective way, there could be two parts of a trigger. There's the understanding that if someone's triggering us, that means that they have control over us.
Right.
And that's really interesting if you think about it. If you're able to separate yourself from that and really be able to become curious about that, like, why am I giving this much power in this moment to this thing?
Right, to a player, to a referee, to a parent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that's why pausing is so important, because if we can, and some of these triggers can carry such a huge charge too, right? That signal is so strong.
Yeah.
Right. And so part of the work for a lot of us is disrupting that signal. And the only way we can disrupt that signal is if we are consciously aware that we're triggered.
Right.
That's where it begins.
Could you give an example of like a trigger and how to disrupt that?
Yeah. When we think about, it can be something as simple as not feeling hurt. Right. You might be practicing with an athlete, and this athlete has issues at home. They might have issues with other coaches. They might have a lot of trauma. Talking about taking on that community aspect. So here in United States, when people get triggered, we kind of treat that as that's their problem to deal with, right? And it doesn't contribute to the healing process or the recovery process, right? In Japan, it's different. When people get triggered, it's an indication that the group synergy is off. So we need to fix this. And not that triggers my responsibility, but how can I better show up for you in that moment? So if we're noticing our players' affect change, and sometimes they're not going to always tell us, right? We have to attune to what's happening in the room, which means if we notice facial expressions changing, and they're so subtle, right? We can ask questions, what do you need in this moment, right? And that can open up so much of the lay ground, if you will, of exploring what that trigger might be for them in that moment.
I'm big on asking questions. It's a big thing because player autonomy is huge. And I feel like one of the things that I'm also hearing, you're kind of talking about these kind of cultural nuances and that you can kind of bring into sport. We can probably dive super in depth into kind of the cultural nuances in the United States, but keeping it on topic of sports and teams is, I feel like, and you can kind of explain the science behind this is I always reference it as a we, right? I always reference like I always take responsibility for, a team, like let's say if we lost, right? It's our responsibility. And so you're kind of talking about a group synergy, you're talking about a trigger. And I feel like the best teams are connected with that synergy, like you talk about, versus like it was your fault you turned the basketball over, instead of like let's be solution oriented. Like I see that you're frustrated that I made a bad pass, my bad. Like, am I getting on the right track, or is that making sense?
Yeah. So you're now, and I want to make sure I'm answering the original question too about what can we do in moments when we're triggered.
Yep.
Right. And I think what you're asking is how do we take ownership while also communicating accountability, maybe?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. And it's so one of the frameworks that I try to put on in this work is that life is a dance, right? And we can't hold someone accountable when they're in a state when they're not stabilized. It would be nice to do that,
Right.
right? But the reality of the situation is that we're dealing with human beings. And so one of the first things that we can offer is compassion, which is lacking in our society. Compassion is the gateway to flow. Beating someone up isn't, psychologically. And this is work we all have to work on because we live in a culture that reinforces these ideas that you have to beat yourself up. You have to go harder and harder and harder. But that's actually not what the science says. That's not what all these great cultures have taught us about the human condition. And we keep missing this point over and over again, is that the path towards connecting is always compassion.
This is really a cool insight, because this is something I've been honestly personally working on more, just on my own shortcomings, right? As a fiance, as a basketball coach, as a business owner. Instead of, like you saying, like traditionally I would beat myself up, I kind of continue to repeat the pattern. And one thing that I see, right, and it's early on and change is hard, I do see better results that if I do mess up, I do make a mistake. I've been trying to give myself more compassion, and I actually see myself like, for some reason, like I'm like kind of releasing some of that control. Like I'm not going to be a perfect person, right? And so that's been one of my biggest areas, is like I think I'm realizing like I was more of a control freak than I maybe put out. Like I'm this chill West Coast guy, but at the same times, right? There's a lot of variables I want to control, and offering that compassion for myself and my own mistakes has actually been really important in my growth process this past month.
That's beautiful. Well said. And I think it's important for us who are leaders within the community to admit that we're still working on these things.
Right.
And thank you for acknowledging that. Vulnerability is power.
Yes.
And when athletes and when members within the community can hear you admit that you have faults, and again, we don't live in a society that fosters this, right? When you're secure within yourself, vulnerability is power. So when you can, another suggestion is that I look for opportunities to say that I messed up. My mentor one time and my therapist, we got into a little disagreement one time, and this is sad but exciting at the same time. This happened about 2 or 3 years ago. I had enough courage to tell him what he did. And I'm so used of people gaslighting and evading me. But to my surprise, he looked me in my eye. He said, "That is mine and that is my fault." So he modeled something that was so important to me, right? Which is accountability. You also mentioned something very important, which is surrendering. It's okay to be messy in life.
Yeah.
We live in a very perfectionistic state of mind.
Yeah.
And what you just described was, when are we going to allow, what space and room is there for children, for teens to make mistakes, for athletes to make mistakes? And they should be able to make mistakes. They need to make as many mistakes as possible, in fact. because that's the path towards greatness.
That's where you learn, right? Mm-hmm. You learn from those mistakes and those opportunities. And, instead of being a 17-year-old playing in a 15U tournament because you want to score 35 points and have 0 assists and be perfect, right? That's not going to help you grow if you want to be a college athlete. And so that's obviously an oversimplification of, like, I feel like even us as coaches, right? And parents, we try to have our kids fail the least amount possible, when in reality, the more mistakes, as long as we create an environment where we can help them have the tools to go within, right? We can actually help them accelerate their growth by looking at those mistakes and identifying, okay, that's okay. Now let's improve.
Exactly. And I would also challenge the improvement part, though, too, ironically.
Yeah.
Right? Because we do want to learn from mistakes, but we also want to encourage an environment where it's okay not to improve. Because again, if we're talking about flow, right? Flow needs to be expansive and not limiting. And when we're talking about being accountable and owning certain things, while that's true, to get into a rhythm in life, right? I had one of my mentors said something so powerful, and this is coming up right now. We were taking a break, and I used to work at Bank of America, and it was a large campus. And he would say hi to everyone. This guy's a Navy guy, someone that I really respected. And he told me, so we were walking one day, and he would just say hi to everyone. And when he would say hi to women, a lot of them wouldn't even acknowledge him, right? And I was sort of thinking egotistically about that. I asked him, I said, why do you do that? They don't want to talk to you. Why are you saying hi? He said something so powerful to me. He said, the more no's I get in life, the closer I am to a yes. So that kind of shifts our idea about what improvement is, right? Maybe it's about clearing the table and trusting the process that what I need will come, and what I am capable of doing on the court will come. And sometimes as parents, as coaches, how we interfere with that process is that we project our fear when they make a mistake.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
And believe me, it's hard, because as I'm saying this, I'm holding myself accountable.
Right.
Because I'm not perfect in this.
Right.
But I do recognize at times that when my athletes, my clients, my kids make mistakes, a lot of that has to do with my reaction.
Right. No, 100%. And we put our own expectations, our own personal fears, our own aspirations on our kids, right? Whether it's me as a coach or for you as a parent, if you're listening to this. So that makes a lot of sense. So I'm sure we could go for hours talking about this, but my final question for you will be, what would your final words of wisdom be to help, inspire parents, to educate parents on and coaches on how they can just build and create and develop and be a part of developing the next generation of young people through athletics?
Yeah. Such a great question. Being a kid and a parent now, I would think about, what is it that you wanted when you were a kid, right? And trying to embody that now. And you talked about surrendering. Surrendering isn't about giving up and not doing work.
Right.
It's the recognition that there's a deep sense of trust that we have, that no matter what happens. And believe me, as a parent and as a psychotherapist, I've had a lot of challenging situations that shook my faith in this work. However, what is surrender? What is the power of surrender? What is this? Trust, right? Trust means that no matter what's happening in the outside world, we are rock solid in our internal world. And that goes back to something I sort of mentioned before. We bend reality not by waiting, not by hoping, but by adjusting our belief systems internally so that our outside world is shaped. It has no, the outside world has no point. It has to capitulate if we're in alignment with ourselves. So my suggestion would be to mind our fear, let what's going to happen take place, and to trust the process. Trust that our children will be okay. Trust that we are capable. Because sometimes when our athletes, our patients, our children make mishaps, we internalize that. And that's not good. You know, when someone makes a mistake, sure, we can look at it as this is a reflection of me, but how helpful is that? Right? What would a confident person do, or how would they react? My final thought on this is that expectations in life aren't a burdensome, but they're a privilege because they push out what's inside of us. It's an opportunity for synchronicity. It's an opportunity to grow. And if we can change our viewpoint of what faith is and what trials aren't meant to destroy us. And trials could be moment to moment. It could be working with an athlete. It could be working on getting an athlete into college. And something can be triggered so instantly within you where you start doubting yourself. You might lose a client. You might lose a dear patient. You might lose a family member, and you might internalize that. But having a strong sense of self, if we operate from that point of view, we understand that what's meant to be will be, what's meant to pass will pass, what will come will come. And if we can trust that, reality shifts to that energy. If we don't trust, reality is going to shift to the non-trusting part. So we want to have a compassionate approach. We want to have a trusting approach. And we want to mind opportunities or situations when we're in a state of fear.
That's a powerful, powerful way to end the podcast, and so much wisdom around really just beginning within and trusting thyself. So if, the listeners want to get more, they want to follow you, they want to reach out to you, what's the best place to find you on the social media world?
Yes. So I have a business page, and hopefully we can link it.
Yep. I'll get it in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah. And that has all of my information, but I hope that this sparks something for your listeners. I hope that, today we were able to take something away that either reaffirmed where we need to be, or perhaps highlight some sort of area in life where we're still adjusting to, but not getting discouraged, but knowing that we will get there.
We will get there. Appreciate your time.
Appreciate you. All
right, good stuff. There we go. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Beyond the Scoreboard podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and share it with a friend, coach, or parent you feel like would get value from this episode. It's our responsibility to impact as many parents and coaches who are the ones that are impacting our athletes. That's how we create a ripple effect. So thank you for being a part of our community, and we look forward to serving you all next week.